away when the real engineers get here. Permission to report, Chief Architect. At ease, General. It's just Elias now.
The smell hit you before anything else did. Burnt oil, old rubber, the metallic tang of a blowtorch that had been running too long in too small a space. Cole County Auto sat at the edge of a two-lane highway in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, just a blinking yellow light that everyone ignored anyway. The shop had 3 bays, one of which hadn't worked since the lift motor died 2 winters back, and a hand-painted sign out front that read, "Open, honest work, honest prices." Inside, under a busted fluorescent light that buzzed like a trapped wasp, a man named Elias Whitfield knelt beside a 15-year-old pickup truck, one hand resting flat against the engine block, the other holding a wrench he hadn't used in almost 10 minutes. He wasn't stalling, he was listening. Elias was 52 years old, built like a man who had done real work his whole life. Broad through the shoulders, strong through the forearms, with hands so permanently stained with grease that the creases in his knuckles looked tattooed black. His coveralls were faded to the color of wet concrete. His name was stitched crooked over the left breast pocket, sewn on by his own hand because he didn't trust anyone else to get the thread even. But it was his eyes people remembered, quiet, still, unhurried. The eyes of a man who had seen more in 1 decade than most people saw in a lifetime, and had decided, deliberately, to never mention any of it again. Folks in town knew him as Eli from the shop. They knew he could fix anything with a motor in it. Tractors, lawnmowers, the sheriff's cruiser, Miss Dolores's ancient Buick that everyone else had given up on. What they didn't know, what nobody in 100 miles knew, was that 6 years earlier, Elias Whitfield had held the title of Lead Aerospace Propulsion Engineer for a classified division of the Department of Defense. He had designed cooling architecture for engines that didn't have names yet, only project numbers. He had briefed generals. He had signed his name on documents that determined how fast the fastest machines in the world could fly. And then he had disappeared, not dramatically, not with sirens or headlines. He had simply resigned, packed up a modest house outside D.C., and moved his wife and daughter to a town small enough that no one would think to look for them there. He told people he was tired of city traffic. The truth was heavier than that. The truth was that 18 months before he vanished, Elias had discovered something buried in a subcontractor's files that wasn't supposed to exist. Evidence that classified propulsion designs, his designs, were being quietly siphoned out through a shell company and sold, piece by piece, to a private tech conglomerate that had no business owning them. He'd reported it, and then things had started happening to his family that felt less like coincidence and more like warning. A car that idled too long outside his daughter's school. A wrong number call at 3 a.m. that lasted exactly long enough for him to hear breathing on the other end. So Elias did the only thing a man protecting his family could do. He went quiet. He went small. He became, on paper, nobody at all. For 6 years, nobody at all fixed carburetors for a living, and he told himself most days that he'd made peace with it. The bell over the shop door jangled hard enough to nearly come off its hook. A car had pulled into the gravel lot outside, if you could call it a car. It looked more like something that had been dreamed up rather than built. Matte black, low to the ground, the kind of vehicle that seemed to swallow the sunlight instead of reflecting it. A prototype. Elias recognized the silhouette immediately. He'd read about it in a trade magazine 6 months back. $500,000, maybe more. It had rolled to a stop at an angle that suggested whoever was driving it had stopped caring about anything, including the car itself, about 30 seconds earlier. The door of the shop banged open, and a young man strode in like he was entering a boardroom instead of a garage. Julian Voss. Elias didn't need an introduction. He'd seen that face on magazine covers in the checkout line. 31 years old, founder and CEO of Vossen Dynamics. A name that got whispered with reverence in Silicon Valley and screamed in headlines about the next Edison. Tailored jacket that cost more than Elias' truck. Sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been cut by someone with a client list of celebrities. A phone pressed to his ear, already mid-sentence, already annoyed. No, I don't care what the board says. Tell them we ship in March or we don't ship at all. Julian snapped his fingers at Elias without looking at him, the universal gesture for come here now, and pointed toward the door. My car just died out there, some kind of engine event. I need it looked at. Elias set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked outside without a word. Julian trailed behind him, still barking into the phone, and it wasn't until Elias popped the hood and leaned in close. One hand braced on the frame, head tilted, eyes half closed. That Julian even seemed to register there was another human being present. Hold on. Julian lowered the phone, staring at Elias like he'd just noticed a stain on the carpet. What are you doing? Listening, Elias said quietly. Julian actually laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. Listening. Right. Look, man, no offense, but this isn't a car you listen to. This has an onboard diagnostic AI more sophisticated than anything you've ever touched. It already ran 40,000 data points and came up empty. So unless you've got a supercomputer under that trucker cap, I need you to just top off whatever fluid looks low and let me make some calls. Elias didn't answer right away. He straightened up, looked at Julian for a long moment, not with anger, not even with much surprise, just a kind of tired, practiced patience, and said, "There's a stutter in your coolant flow. Somewhere around the third stage before it hits the heat exchanger. It's intermittent, which is why your AI's missing it. It only shows up under sustained load, at a very specific thermal threshold, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you knew exactly what pattern you were hunting for. Otherwise, it just reads as noise. For just a second, something flickered across Julian's face, not respect. Closer to irritation that the grease-stained man in front of him had used the phrase heat exchanger correctly. But he recovered fast, sliding back into the condescension like it was a jacket he was more comfortable wearing. That's cute, Julian said. Really. But I've got actual engineers, real ones, with degrees from real places, flying in from Palo Alto tonight. So why don't you go ahead and let the professionals handle proprietary technology? And you can, I don't know, change my oil or something. That's more your speed, right? He looked Elias up and down, taking in the coveralls, the grease, the crooked stitching of his own name. People like you are great at oil changes. This is a little above the pay grade of a small-town shop. The words landed the way they were meant to. A few feet away, a hydraulic line under the supercar's frame gave a soft hiss and released a thin, dark thread of fluid onto the gravel. The very leak Elias had just described. Julian glanced down at it, unbothered, already turning back to his phone. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded $20 bill and dropped it onto the ground at Elias' feet. Mop that up, he said. And stay out of the way when the real engineers get here. He put the phone back to his ear and walked off toward the shade of the building without looking back. Sorry, where was I? Yeah, tell the board march, final answer. Elias looked down at the $20 bill lying in a puddle of his own diagnosed leak. He didn't pick it up. He didn't say anything at all. He simply stood there in the gravel lot, hands in his pockets, watching Julian pace and talk and gesture with the easy, unbothered confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant it. 6 years ago, men in far more expensive suits than Julian's had called Elias Dr. Whitfield and stood up when he entered a room. Now he was being told to mop up a leak he'd diagnosed by ear in under 10 seconds. Using nothing but the sound of a dying engine and 30 years of instinct that no algorithm on Earth could fully replicate. He almost laughed, almost, because here was the thing Julian Voss didn't know, couldn't have known, standing there in his sunglasses and his tailored jacket. Elias wasn't looking at a broken supercar anymore. He was looking at something else entirely. A pattern, a signature, a ghost of an idea he recognized in his bones the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in years. That cooling architecture, that third stage stutter. The exact flaw in the exact place that only existed in one design on the entire planet. His own. A design that had been sealed under a classified DoD project number 6 years ago. A design he had buried, deliberately, one layer deeper than any spec sheet or blueprint would ever show. Not a coding error, not a listed part, but a structural signature worked directly into the geometry of the cooling channel itself. The kind of thing that wouldn't trip a single test, wouldn't fail an inspection, wouldn't even register as a flaw at all, unless the person examining it already knew in their bones. Exactly what they were listening for. Vossen's engineers hadn't missed a bug. They'd inherited a fingerprint they didn't know was there, buried so deep in the physical architecture that $200 million of R&D would never have found a reason to touch it. Because to them, it wasn't broken. It was simply how the system had always behaved. Elias crouched back down beside the open hood, not to fix anything, but to look closer. To be sure, his pulse hadn't changed, his hands were steady. But somewhere behind those quiet, tired eyes, 6 years of silence had just started, very carefully to end. Fairy tales, Julian called over, catching the look on Elias' face and mistaking it for confusion. That's what my old physics professor used to call guys who thought they could outthink a supercomputer with a screwdriver and a hunch. No offense, man. Some people just aren't built for this century. Elias closed the hood, slow and deliberate, the way a man closes a door on a memory he isn't ready to discuss yet. No offense taken, he said quietly. But what Julian Voss didn't know, what he wouldn't understand for another 20 minutes, and wouldn't fully feel for the rest of his life, was that he hadn't just insulted a mechanic. He had just driven the single piece of evidence that would end his career directly into the hands of the one man on Earth who'd know it on sight. Before we get to what happened next, drop a comment and let us know, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe people deserve to be judged by their character and not their coveralls, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's story is going to change the way you look at every ordinary person you pass on the street. Because in exactly 10 minutes, a fleet of black SUVs was about to turn off that quiet two-lane highway. And Julian Voss's entire world was about to come apart in a gravel parking lot he'd been arrogant enough to think was beneath him. The sound came first, a low, distant rumble that didn't belong on a road built for pickup trucks and school buses. Elias heard it before he saw it, the way he heard everything, and he straightened up slowly from the open hood, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his belt. Julian didn't notice at all. He was still pacing near the shade of the shop's overhang, phone glued to his ear, mid-rant about quarterly projections to someone 3,000 miles away. It wasn't until the first black SUV crested the small rise in the highway, followed by a second, and then a third, and finally a massive military transport vehicle that looked wildly out of place next to the shop's faded open sign, that Julian's voice trailed off mid-sentence. I'll call you back," he muttered, lowering the phone. The convoy rolled into the gravel lot in a formation that looked less like an arrival and more like a deployment, kicking up a curtain of dust that hung amber in the afternoon light. Doors opened in unison. Men and women in dark suits stepped out first, fanning into a loose perimeter with the practiced calm of people who had done this exact thing 100 times before. Then the rear door of the transport vehicle swung open, and a man stepped down onto the gravel with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to rooms falling silent when he entered them. 4 silver stars gleamed on his shoulder. Julian's entire posture changed in an instant. The phone disappeared into his jacket pocket. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and something that might have been described charitably as a smile spread across his face. This, Julian understood immediately, was an opportunity. 4-star generals did not show up in small towns for nothing, and Julian Voss had never in his life let a room full of important people go by without making sure they knew his name. He stepped forward, hand already extended. "General, this is an honor, truly. Julian Voss, Vossen Dynamics. I have to say, if this is about the defense contract proposal my team submitted last quarter, I'd love 10 minutes of your time." The general walked past him without a flicker of acknowledgement, as though Julian were a fence post, standing in an inconvenient spot on the gravel. Julian's hand hung in the air a moment too long before he lowered it, his easy smile faltering into confusion. Sorry, General, I don't think you..." But the general wasn't listening. He was walking with long, deliberate strides, straight past the supercar, past the black SUVs, past the small crowd of agents fanning out behind him, straight toward the man in the grease-stained coveralls, standing quietly by the open garage bay. The general stopped 3 feet in front of Elias Whitfield, and then in front of 24 federal agents, a stunned tech billionaire, and the empty gravel lot of a small-town auto shop. a 4-star general of the United States military, snapped to attention and raised his hand in a slow, formal, unmistakable salute. "Permission to report, Chief Architect." For a moment nobody moved. Somewhere down the highway a truck horn sounded faintly and faded. Julian stood frozen, his mouth half open around a word he never finished saying. Ilias exhaled, long and slow, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd nearly forgotten it was there. He returned the salute, not sharply, not like a soldier, but with the quiet, weathered ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times a lifetime ago and had never fully let the habit go. "At ease, General Holloway," Ilias said. "It's just Ilias now. Has been for 6 years. Respectfully, sir, it hasn't been just Ilias since about 40 minutes ago." General Holloway's eyes flicked just briefly toward the highway behind him. "We weren't hunting for you today, sir. We were already closing in on Voss. My task force has had a joint operation with DCIS. Staged 1 county over for the better part of a week, waiting on a magistrate to sign the last warrant. The moment his onboard system logged an engine fault and pinged for roadside diagnostics, our people flagged it. We've had a location trigger on that vehicle for months. We were already moving on him. We just weren't expecting to find you standing over his hood when we got here." Julian found his voice, though it came out thinner than he intended. "I'm sorry, Chief Architect. Breach. I think there's some kind of mistake. I don't know who this man is, but I can assure you, whatever. Mr. Voss," a woman stepped forward from the cluster of agents, holding a slim black folder, her credentials clipped visibly to her lapel. "Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We've been building a case against Vossen Dynamics for the last 14 months. Specifically, against the Propulsion Division's Series 7 thermal management system, the one your company has publicly claimed as proprietary. Patent-pending technology developed in-house. It is proprietary," Julian said, and for the first time a note of real alarm cracked through the confidence. "We spent $200 million developing that system. I have the R&D records, the patent filings, You have records," the agent said evenly, "of a system that was reverse-engineered from stolen, classified schematics originating from a Department of Defense propulsion program 6 years ago. A program that was shut down abruptly after its lead engineer discovered evidence that a subcontractor, a shell company, later traced back through 4 layers of shell ownership to an early investment vehicle connected to your company, was extracting and selling those schematics before the ink on the classification stamps was even dry." Julian's face had gone the color of old paper. But it didn't stay that way for long. Something in him, the same instinct that had built a 4,000-employee company out of sheer force of will, clawed its way back up. "This is absurd." His voice rose, sharper now, more like the man who had walked into the shop an hour earlier. "You people show up with a mechanic and a folder and expect me to just... No. No, I want my legal team on the phone right now. I want to see a warrant. I want to see whatever evidence you think you have because I built that system. I hired the engineers. I signed the checks. If some contractor sold us something they shouldn't have, that's on them, not on me. I run a company of 4,000 people. I don't personally vet every line of every schematic that comes through the door." "You don't have to vet it, Mr. Voss," the agent said. "Your chief technology officer flagged irregularities in the Series 7 origin documents 2 years ago, in writing, in an internal email that you personally replied to. We have that email. In it, you instructed him, and I'm quoting directly, to stop asking questions the lawyers already answered." She let that sit for a moment. "We also have the wire transfers. 4 layers of shell ownership feels like a lot of distance, Mr. Voss, until you find the one signature at the very top of the chain, on the very first check 6 years ago. It's yours." Julian opened his mouth again, some fresh denial already forming, and then stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say seemed to die somewhere between his chest and his throat as he watched the agent turn one more page in her folder. Not for his benefit, just habit, and he realized, all at once, that this wasn't a negotiation. It was already over. It had probably been over for months, and he was only now being told. "You," he said instead, turning slowly toward Ilias. "You're not a mechanic." "I am a mechanic," Ilias said. "I've been one for 6 years, best one in 3 counties if you ask around." He paused, But before that, I designed the cooling architecture your company stole. The third stage stutter you couldn't find with 40,000 data points and a supercomputer. I put a version of that flaw into an early prototype on purpose, 11 years ago, as an internal watermark. A fingerprint baked so deep into the geometry that no amount of money or testing would ever flag it as an error, because it isn't one. It's just mine. I never told the DoD I did it. Wasn't in the file. Your engineers didn't miss a bug. They inherited a signature and never knew it was there. But the second I heard it in your engine today, I knew exactly whose stolen blueprints were sitting under that hood. The agent held up a printed page from her folder, schematics, side by side. One stamped classified and dated 6 years prior, the other pulled from a Vossen Dynamics patent filing dated 3 years later. Even from a distance, even to someone with no engineering background, the geometry was identical down to the smallest curve. We've had investigators trying to prove this link for over a year, the agent continued. The paperwork was clean. Your legal team is very good, Mr. Voss. They scrubbed the paper trail almost perfectly. Almost. What they couldn't scrub was the actual hardware. The physical proof was always going to be in the metal itself. We just needed the one person alive who could look at that engine and read it like a signature instead of a serial number. She glanced at Elias. General Holloway's team has been trying to locate Dr. Whitfield for 6 years to close this case. We didn't find him. You drove your evidence straight to his garage and asked him to fix it for $20. Julian let out a short, disbelieving laugh. The kind that comes out when a person's mind hasn't caught up with the ground falling away beneath them. But it faded fast, replaced by something quieter and much closer to fear. This is insane, this is. I built a company, I built an empire, I have 4,000 employees, I did not steal. Mr. Voss, General Holloway's voice was quiet, but it cut through the lot like a blade. Your company's founding seed round, 6 years ago, was financed in part through an investment fund, whose sole prior transaction was the acquisition of stolen federal propulsion data. You didn't just benefit from the theft, sir. Our forensic accountants believe the theft is the reason Vossen Dynamics exists at all. Without Dr. Whitfield's designs, there is no Series 7 system. Without the Series 7 system, there is no flagship product. Without the flagship product, he let the sentence hang unfinished, because everyone standing in that gravel lot understood exactly how it ended. Julian turned back to Elias one final time, and the fight seemed to finally go out of him all at once, like a held breath finally released. The arrogance was gone entirely, stripped away like a coat of paint left out too long in the sun. What was left underneath looked almost young. A man realizing all at once that every headline, every magazine cover, every standing ovation at every conference stage had been built on a foundation that belonged to someone else. To the man he'd thrown a $20 bill at less than an hour ago and told to mop the floor. Why didn't you say something? Julian said, and it wasn't quite a question. Back there, when I was. When I said all that, why didn't you tell me who you were? Elias looked at him for a long moment, and there was no triumph in his face, no cruelty. Just the same tired, steady patience he'd had all along. Because you didn't ask who I was, Elias said. You already decided. That's the thing about people like you, Julian. You don't listen for the truth. You just wait for the world to agree with what you already believe. He gestured, almost gently, toward the folded 20 still lying in the gravel, dark now with hydraulic fluid. You can keep your money. I was never mopping that up for you. The lead investigative agent stepped forward, unclipping a pair of handcuffs from her belt, with the calm efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion 100 times. Julian Voss, you're being detained pending formal charges related to theft of classified defense technology, corporate espionage, and violation of federal export and security statutes. You have the right to remain silent. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the same wrists that, an hour earlier, had thrown a $20 bill at a man's feet like table scraps. Julian Voss said nothing at all. There was, for the first time that day, nothing left in him arrogant enough to say. They led Julian Voss to one of the black SUVs in silence. He didn't fight it, didn't posture for the small crowd that had begun gathering at the edge of the lot. A few neighbors, a woman from the diner across the road. A kid on a bicycle who'd stopped pedaling to stare. There was no audience left for Julian to perform for. The version of himself that needed an audience had walked out of that gravel lot the moment the handcuffs closed, and what climbed into the back of that SUV was someone smaller, someone who suddenly understood that the world he'd built his identity on had never really belonged to him in the first place. As the door shut behind him, the supercar, his $500,000 prototype, still sitting with its hood up and a thin line of fluid darkening the gravel beneath it, was carefully loaded onto a flatbed by two agents in nitrile gloves, tagged and logged as evidence. The machine that had once represented everything Julian believed about himself, his brilliance, his inevitability, the sheer force of his own ambition, was now just Exhibit A in a federal case that would take his company apart piece by piece. General Holloway watched the convoy prepare to move out, then turned back to Elias, who stood exactly where he'd stood for the last 20 minutes. Hands still faintly trembling now that the adrenaline of the moment had started to ebb. 6 years, sir, Holloway said quietly. We ran every lead we had. Databases, financial trails, old contacts, your sister in Ohio, your wife's maiden name. We followed all of it and came up empty every time. You disappeared like you were trained to. I was trained to, Elias said. Just not by the people who trained me to build engines. He glanced toward the shop, toward the crooked hand-painted sign, toward 6 years of quiet. Unremarkable Tuesdays that had kept his family safe and unnoticed. I wasn't hiding because I was scared for myself, General. I was hiding because the people who took my work made it very clear what would happen to my daughter if I kept pushing. Holloway's jaw tightened. That threat is neutralized now, sir. Voss's security chief has already started talking, trying to cut a deal before the DOJ gets to him first. We have names. We have the men who sat outside your daughter's school 6 years ago. This ends today, all of it. For the first time since the SUVs had pulled into the lot, something in Elias' shoulders loosened. A tension so old it had become part of the shape of him, unwinding in front of a stranger's car repair bay on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There's more, Holloway continued. I wasn't sent here just to close a criminal case, Dr. Whitfield. I was sent here with an offer, and I'll be honest with you, it comes from a lot higher up than my own desk. He reached into his jacket and produced a slim leather folder, holding it out. The department is standing up a new task force, National Innovation and Security, cross-agency, direct reporting line to the Secretary. Its entire mandate is closing exactly the kind of gap that let Voss get away with this for 6 years. Brilliant people, brilliant designs. Sitting exposed because the system protecting them was too slow, too political, or too blind to see the theft happening right under its nose. He held the folder out further. They want you to run it, sir. Full reinstatement, full clearance restored, and something no engineer in that program has ever had before, real authority. Not just a lab and a badge. A seat at the table where the decisions get made. Elias didn't reach for the folder right away. He looked past the general, out toward the two-lane highway, the blinking yellow light nobody obeyed. The diner where he'd eaten a Denver omelet every Sunday morning for 6 years, without a single soul knowing what he used to be. He thought about his daughter, 17 now, who had grown up thinking her father was just a man who came home every night smelling like brake fluid and honest work. He thought about how he'd almost let that quiet life become the whole story instead of just the chapter where he'd been healing. On one condition, Elias said finally. Holloway raised an eyebrow. Name it. I don't want a task force built only out of people with degrees from places like MIT and Stanford, Elias said. I want a pipeline built out of people like the ones I grew up with. Mechanics, machinists, welders, folks who understand how metal actually behaves under stress because they've had it under their hands their whole lives, not just on a screen. Give me the authority to build a real bridge between the trade floor and the engineering bench, and I'll take the job. The general studied him for a moment, then allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Chief Architect, that condition is going to be a lot easier to sell to the secretary than you think. He extended his hand, and this time Elias took it, not the stiff. Formal handshake of a subordinate greeting a superior, but the grip of two men who had, in different ways, spent their careers protecting something larger than themselves. "There's one more thing," Holloway added, almost as an afterthought, as the agents finished loading the last of the evidence into the transport vehicle behind them. "The $20 bill Voss threw at your feet. It's still sitting out there in the gravel. Evidence team wants to know if you want it bagged as part of the case file." Some junior agents already half convinced it's symbolic enough for the closing argument. Elias looked down at the crumpled bill, dark now with hydraulic fluid, half sunk into the dust where it had landed. He thought about picking it up, if only to see it up close one more time. The small, careless cruelty of a man who'd never once had to wonder whether the world would take him seriously. "Leave it," Elias said. "Let the gravel keep it. I never needed it in the first place." The days that followed moved faster than Elias expected. Federal investigators descended on Vossen Dynamics headquarters within 48 hours, executing warrants that had apparently been drafted and ready for months, waiting only for the physical evidence that had finally, almost accidentally, driven itself into a small-town garage. Employees who had spent years building products under Julian's name learned, almost overnight, that the foundation of their work had never been solid ground at all. Several of the company's senior engineers, it turned out, had long suspected something was wrong with the origins of the Series 7 system. Whispers about the acquisition that nobody dared ask too many questions about, but had said nothing, either out of loyalty, fear, or the kind of willful blindness that comes easily when the paychecks are large enough. Elias was asked, more than once, whether he felt any satisfaction watching Vossen Dynamics collapse in the weeks that followed. He always gave some version of the same answer. Satisfaction wasn't really the word for it. What he felt was something quieter, the strange, almost disorienting relief of finally being believed, after 6 years of having to disappear rather than fight to be heard. The shop closed for the last time 3 weeks later. Word had gotten around town fast, faster than anyone expected in a place that's small, and on Elias' final Friday, half of Cole County showed up in the gravel lot just to shake his hand. Miss Delors brought a pie. The sheriff brought a photo he'd secretly taken of Elias saluting the general, framed with the words, "We always knew you were something special," scrawled underneath in Sharpie. Elias laughed harder that day than he had in 6 years. He didn't sell the shop. He handed the keys to his old apprentice, a 19-year-old named Marcus who'd been sweeping floors and learning brake jobs after school for 2 years, and told him the same thing his own mentor had told him 30 years earlier: take care of people, and the work takes care of itself. 6 months later, in a small auditorium in Washington, D.C., Dr. Elias Whitfield stood at a podium in front of 200 people. Cabinet officials, engineers, reporters, and in the second row, his wife and daughter, along with a busload of trade school students who'd been flown in from 4 different states. He announced the launch of the Grease to Greatness Foundation. It wasn't a token gesture. It was fully funded, backed by federal grant money, and in no small irony, a substantial portion of the seized and liquidated assets of Vossen Dynamics, now dissolved and sold off in the wake of Julian Voss's conviction. The foundation offered full-ride scholarships for mechanics, machinists, welders, and trade workers to pursue engineering degrees, with a guarantee written directly into the program's charter that no applicant would ever be asked to prove their worth through a resume alone. Every single one of them would get an interview with someone who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated by people in suits. Julian Voss, meanwhile, sat in a federal courtroom 3 states away, listening to a judge read out a sentence that ended a career built on someone else's brilliance. His company's assets were liquidated within the year. His name, once printed in gold on the cover of business magazines, became a case study taught in university ethics courses under a much simpler title: Arrogance as a Business Model. At the close of the ceremony, a young reporter asked Elias the question everyone in that auditorium was thinking. "Doctor Whitfield, after everything Julian Voss said to you, after everything he did, do you feel like justice was served?" Elias considered the question for a long moment, the way he considered everything. Unhurried, deliberate, listening for the truth underneath the noise. "Justice isn't really about what happens to him," Elias said finally. It's about what happens to the next kid standing in a garage somewhere, covered in grease, getting looked at like he doesn't matter. Justice is making sure that kid has somewhere to go besides silence. He paused, and a small, tired smile crossed his face. True power was never in Julian's bank account. It never was. Real power is the quiet dignity of knowing exactly who you are, even especially